Welcome back to another video. This video will be about insulin sensitivity and probably something we have covered many times, but as usual, we have done this for a couple of years now, and things come up all the time, new light and more understanding on our part as well. And I believe a lot of people don't understand what it actually means. So maybe you could go into depth about what insulin sensitivity is and how can people assess it as well. Because more often than not, we always highlight, hey, you need to do blood tests. Maybe there is something that they can do without blood test.
Yeah. There are some anecdotal stuff. We'll start with like what it is, why you want to, what do you want out of it, right? And what do you get out of it when you have good insulin sensitivity? So insulin sensitivity is basically this: how much insulin is required for you to maintain a good glucose level in your blood. And I would also take that a little bit step further, especially when it comes to performance and physique type goals, is how responsive that is. How quickly do you catch glucose in the blood? So, for example, if you eat, I don't know, 200 grams of carbs, right? Does your body act fast enough to control the flow of carbs, meaning your blood sugar doesn't go way too high and then come down really, really hard? Because that would be like a delayed effect, right? So that means that you ate these carbs, blood sugar is climbing and your body takes a little bit of time before it catches on, and then it overshoots how much insulin, then you have a crash. So that actually happens quite a bit to people when they are starting to have insulin sensitivity, meaning they'll eat a bolus of food, they get some brain fog, and then maybe 60 minutes to 90 minutes later, they start getting cravings for more food. Not necessarily cravings like they're hungry, but cravings for sugar, right? Like literal sugar, like, hey, I want, a candy bar, or I want something sweet or something salty or something along those lines. And that just means that you had an overshoot of insulin to control that blood glucose. Now, the more chronic version of that is when your blood glucose is controlled, but it takes a lot of insulin to keep it under control, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about the anecdotal ways to kind of test this, but right now we'll talk numbers in blood work so that, we're talking concrete things, okay? So a good insulin sensitivity ratio or number set that I look for is, in a fasted state, your glucose is in the good range. It doesn't really matter to me whether it's in the 90s or 80s. A lot of people pay attention to those zones. That is a little bit more individual because size matters and male and female matters. So I don't really pay attention to, it needs to be in the 80s and that's good versus the 90s. As long as it's good, right, under 100, and your fasted insulin, is under 5, ideally something like 3 or 4, right? These are American numbers, by the way. So I'd have to do some conversion.
So straight away, I got questions. Can this be tested at home without intravenous blood test?
Yes. So I have seen, right, there's some, they're a little bit more expensive. They're not just a blood glucose monitor, but they test ketones, glucose, and insulin, right? So there is called a glucose trimeter, essentially. So it tests all three, right?
Well, that's a finger prick, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it is. But it gets expensive because you need separate test strips for the different tests. Right. But yes, it looks just like a blood glucose monitor, but it doesn't just test glucose. It tests ketones, glucose, and insulin. Those are very valuable. And that would be a simple way to do it. And it is just a finger prick. You don't need a intravenous blood pull. But when you get blood work, I always suggest testing insulin sensitivity and doing it fasted for that reason, especially if it's a new client or something like that, because I want to know that right off the bat of what is your insulin sensitivity. Not just because that tells me a little bit about like what to do with your nutrition, and we'll get into this. Insulin sensitivity gets influenced by environmental factors as well. Okay, so that's good insulin sensitivity. Your glucose is in a good range, and your insulin is around a 4 or slightly less. At a 5, there's a tipping point that I've noticed, right? If your insulin is above a 5, say it's a 6 or a 7, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's poor insulin sensitivity. It means that at that point in time, you've either pushed diet, carbohydrate consumption, etc., to probably the most that you want. At that point, you're going to start getting diminishing returns. You're going to put on more body fat than accomplishing sensitive muscle tissue accrual. And it's time to either reduce carbohydrate intake or actually diet, etc. Lots of different things there.
Let me ask you
There's
this. Can
you
this
go
be
ahead.
controlled by using blood glucose monitors? Because that's still a very popular thing to do.
I
And
don't find that.
I'll intervene there. I'm like, I sometimes do it with a lot of people for a couple of weeks just to see what the hell are you eating. We're not going to change any of your nutrition. I'm just going to show you which part of the day might be messing you up. And they usually go, oh, hell, I shouldn't be eating this. I shouldn't be drinking that. This is it. This is why I'm feeling tired after my meeting, because I had this before. I usually have that because of my habit, and so on and so forth. Alcohol
Yes.
being the worst out of them all. But as such, I cannot justify anyone using blood glucose monitor all the time unless you're diabetic.
Yeah, so I 100% agree with that. You're the blood glue, like, okay, once you're a, if you're a coach or you're somebody that kind of understands what we're talking about, yes, you can use one side of the equation, aka the blood glucose monitor, because they're cheap, they're easy to get, they're not expensive at all to use. It's easy to kind of, and just like you said, because you know what they're eating or should be eating, and you know how blood glucose acts during the day and stuff like that, you can tell a client, hey, test your blood glucose at this point in time during the day. It should be, so many minutes after your meal or middle of the day because you've done a certain, workout or before workout, etc. And you can get a feel for their insulin sensitivity that way. It's not going to tell you what their insulin sensitivity is, but it will tell you whether it's moving in a good direction or not, right? So yes, that is valuable. That's a little bit more intuitive, and you're not really going to be able to explain it to somebody unless they have experience doing it, right? So
I only
yes.
bring it up because so many people go like, hey, this is a great, and it helped me to lose this and that. And well, all it's going to tell you is stop eating garbage.
Yeah,
You don't really
exactly.
need to buy
And
anything.
again, a lot of times that resolves a lot of just not eating processed garbage does resolve a lot of that issue. I have seen that. There are unique circumstances, and I'll highlight those a little bit, where environmental factors can influence insulin sensitivity, irrelevant of diet, right? And those are, I wouldn't say more common, but they are on the rise, especially in cities, number one. Number two, in certain demographic areas that exploit 5G technologies and things of that nature. And why is that? And the reason for that is a lot of artificial light. And again, when I say artificial light, I don't just mean LED lights and stuff like that. I mean the whole artificial light spectrum, meaning Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, all of those. The reason for that is because of the mammal adaptation to those types of frequencies that stimulates the release of glucose from the liver, right? And I will see this in blood work in the following manner. Glucose is fine. Insulin sensitivity is like slightly subpar, like a 6 or a 7, right? It's a little bit above the 5. And then, I kind of look at what they eat and everything, and it looks normal, looks whole food wise. They're not really eating excess junk or carbohydrates, but their A1C, which is the historical marker of how much glucose is in the blood, is like a 5.6 or a 5.7, aka slightly pre-diabetic. And what that tells us is something is releasing, somehow you're getting glucose into the bloodstream chronically over the last 100 days. And that can only be achieved when you are secreting insulin and glucose chronically, even when you sleep, right? So if I get a fasted number that's slightly aberrant and a glucose number that's slightly aberrant, and then we look, but they're normal, right? They're like at the higher end, but they're still normal. The doctor wouldn't say anything about it. And then we look at their A1C and it clearly shows, a pre-diabetic state. Then I go, that tells me that there's a chronic stimulus of input going on. And
This
that's
is
when I start
something
asking.
that I see as well, especially in America, because everyone is now into longevity and whatnot. Pretty much every single person that I have worked with who go on ipamorelin, they have their HbA1c messed up.
Yeah, and so if you think about that, that's exactly what epimorelin is doing from a chemical standpoint, right? And because of what you said, right? They go to longevity clinics, and epimorelin is supposed to be a growth hormone secretagogue, which it does do that, but it does it in a way that actually stimulates the release of glucose as well.
And they never get explained that.
Correct, right? Because what it's going to do is it's going to drive hunger to stimulate the growth hormone release. Well, hunger is also associated with, AKA, your liver is going to compensate for that if you don't feed it, and it's going to stimulate blood glucose release, right? So you end up with a stimulus, a chronic stimulus of blood glucose that's going up and up and up and up, even if you're not eating the food, right? Now, that can be achieved chemically, like you just described, or physiologically through physics of how lights interact with cells and send the signal to the central chiasmatic nucleus, which is this artificial light stimulus that I'm talking about. You can achieve it both ways, and the outcome is you slowly erode your insulin sensitivity.
And you already highlighted, I'm just reminding everyone, that means you are less likely to burn body fat efficiently, and more likely you're going to start storing body fat quicker as well.
Correct. Right.
So let's
It will
dig into-
seem, yeah,
Yeah,
it will seem like, yeah, anytime I eat excess, right, I just gain body fat, and you can tell, right? Like, people are pretty intuitive, especially with
and
their
I
bodies.
see it
Like,
not even in excess. I see people who are trying to religiously diet down. They are in calorie deficit. They just start to struggle because they introduce hypomorelin. So the
yeah,
body fat
yeah,
is just staying there and fighting for its existence there.
yeah, yeah, and it's either one of two things: either the doctor is ignorant of this mechanism of how it works, and they're just going purely on the growth hormone secreting thing, and growth hormone is good, or they don't explain it to the client, and the client just thinks that it's doing one thing when it's actually doing multiple things.
Let's talk about benefits of insulin sensitivity. So we kind of discussed before we even started recording how you can see it sometimes. What could be benefits physically and mentally? Because you already kind of touched up. Hey, if your insulin sensitivity is not up on par, you'll have these energy spikes and dips and all kind of stuff. What other benefits is there apart from, hey, if your insulin sensitivity is in control, you're gonna have less of kind of instances in a day where you want to just fall asleep.
Yeah, yeah, and so that's why I wanted to group it together, as far as, or not group it together, but add in a secondary mechanism, which is the speed of action, right? So insulin sensitivity as a whole, and a chronic, sorry, truck went by, and as a chronic stimulator. In other words, you're not going to really put on a lot of the body fat part, right? Like, where, hey, if I overeat a little bit, I just put on body fat. That's more of a long-term problem when insulin sensitivity has been eroded for long-term, a few months at minimum. Most of the time, it's more like 6 months to years, where your insulin sensitivity is poor enough that you just put on body fat, right? That part is associated with long-term insulin sensitivity erosion. Acute insulin sensitivity happens in a growth phase for most people. They're going to notice it, where their body is just not reacting fast enough to the big boluses of carbohydrates. Now, in the bodybuilding world, that is kind of to be expected, right? Because you're not doing what normal people are doing. You're consuming in way larger amounts of carbohydrates, and that's for necessity, because you're also trying to achieve aberrant amounts of muscle tissue, right? And so some of that can be mitigated with some of the strategies that you employ, right? Grounding is a great one to reduce the acute ones. And so these are the acute symptoms of the speed of action of your insulin response is lowered. And that could be brain fog after eating big boluses of carbohydrates, and then followed by cravings of actual sugar. And the reason for that is, like I briefly explained earlier, you have a big bolus, glucose starts to climb, and it takes a while for your body, your pancreas, to release enough insulin to counteract that. But what it ends up doing is it overshoots just a little bit, and it drives that glucose down low enough that now the body senses, oh, this is low blood sugar. And so then it sends some cravings for sugar to either refill the blood glucose, or it stimulates the liver to release glucose itself, right? And so that is more of sensitivity in the acute senses. And so you're going to get the acute side effects of a little bit of brain fog, maybe a little bit lethargy after, definitely some cravings, not all of those at the same time, just some or all. Usually it's only one or two. It's never usually all three. And that is easily corrected by changing just how you eat throughout the day, and some behaviors around light, right? So for example, eating your biggest carbohydrate containing meal outside, that's a very small, low hanging fruit hack that works very, very well for people that are having this issue. Grounding works exceptionally well for this as well. And the reason for that is whenever you're inside, the blood cells tend to clump, like, and we have data on this with actual, microscope metering. So I've actually, so my kids have like a little microscope that connects to the phone. That's really actually really dang impressive, right? For not being super expensive. And you can literally prick your finger. If I've been indoors for like 2 or 3 hours, I can see my red blood cells looking blocky, literally like they start to look almost like bricks and they start to stack. After I go outside for about 10 or 15 minutes, prick my finger, put the blood underneath the petri dish, completely different looking blood cells. They're more round, they're spaced out a little bit more. They literally flow better, right? So think about this. If it's a delayed signaling issue, right? Because that's what we're talking about. Hey, you consume food, it takes a while for your body to catch on. It's also a blood flow issue because that's what's sending the signal, right? So if your blood is clumping and not moving well, that's going to add to the delayed effect. If you speed up how the blood flows, then you're going to get more acute insulin sensitivity. So with that mindset, right, what I just explained are really low passive ways to do it: grounding, sunlight, eating outside. But there are physical ways to do that, aka taking a walk after, you're improving blood flow, right? Taking a walk after a meal, or even before the meal, right? Like just having blood flow moving at a faster rate than it would when you're sedentary, in any way, shape, or form, will improve that acute. It's the best way that I find to improve that acute sense of, hey, I ate a lot of carbohydrates and I'm getting a little bit of brain fog. Get more blood flow. Get more
I will
blood flow
break
in
down,
anything.
but I always do. At the moment, I'm having around 150 to 200 grams of carbs every single meal. So, and each meal ends up with 10-minute walk outside
Yep.
every single
Yep.
day. So if I stop doing that within 2, 3 days, I know I'm going to start getting lethargic. My appetite's going to start suffering, and I'm going to start gaining body fat and just brain fog, all the things that come with it. I think you explained about blood as well. When I did my studies in universities for my master's degree, we did follow-ups on blood tests on professors. Anyone who spent more than 4 hours inside, not moving, usually had really poor blood test. And after they moved for 15 minutes, it was great. And you're like, how the hell do you explain that?
Yeah,
Because
it
not
doesn't take
every
very long.
professor needs to go from one building to another. In a campus, they go from one place to another. And one of the leading professors, he used to walk to completely different place, and it's like half an hour's walk. He just loved it. And he was the healthiest out of all of them.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And that effect, like I said, walking is manual, but if you're walking outside, you're getting a bonus, right? Because infrared light, what does it also do? It stimulates the movement of the ATPase and more flow of electrons, right? So what that's doing is it's actually stimulating the uptake of, because what is electron, flow? Electron flow is meaning carbohydrates or fats, fuel essentially, is donating its electrons. You're accelerating the uptake of everything that you're consuming throughout the day, right? So literally, red light, there are studies out on it now, lowers glucose levels by up to 30% in diabetics, right? In diabetics, not so normal people, it's probably a little bit more. In diabetics, people with poor insulin sensitivity, red light stimulation indoors will lower their glucose by up to 30%. The average was something between 15 and 20, right? So if you take that and then go, okay, well, that's with a red light therapy box, which isn't nearly as powerful as the sun, especially at certain times of the year. That's going to be accelerated. You add a little bit of movement, that's going to be even more accelerated, right? And like you said, with the blood clumping, right? The blood clumping is a big deal, especially after 2020, right? Because that is one of the major contributing things to clots, right? That's a big deal if you've been vaccinated. If you are trying to prevent that, the biggest arsenal, low-hanging free thing that you can do is get more outside movement, microdosed throughout the day, right?
So
Especially if
let me
you're in
give
that
you
camp.
an example of, let's say, imaginative figure that is trying to lose body fat. They wake up every single morning, but they live in a place where they cannot go outside, but they have their own personal gym and they have Peloton bike, let's say, and they have access to red light therapy. Would it be
Yeah.
beneficial for them to wake up,
Mm-hmm.
set red light therapy, jump on that bike, pedal for 25, 40 minutes, whatever they want to.
I would even go a step further. I would go a step further. If they have the means and the money and the limiting factor is I can't physically go outside, right? I would say periodically, at least because it's going to be diminished, right? It's not going to be as strong as the sun. It's not going to be as effective as grounding outside. I would say a minimum of 20 minutes, ideally 30 minutes of intense red light therapy. So like maybe you have a room where you have a Peloton bike, turn the damn screen off on the Peloton bike, right? Don't have the big screen shining at your face. That's counterproductive. So turn that off, put on your red light therapy box, and get a grounding strip for like what electricians use, people that work on circuitry. What that is it's a cuff. It's a little bracelet, and it'll have a cord on it, and you ground it just like a grounding mat to your electrical circuitry, right? Double check that your electrical circuitry is grounded properly. You can either hire an electrician, or there are lots of little gadgets that can plug in and actually test that you're grounded correctly.
Both have it, right?
Yep. So you ground red light therapy. So now you're at least getting those two effects plus movement from the Peloton bike. You get 30-minute, I would say ideal, right? Again, this person can't go outside. Ideal would be 2 to 3 20-minute sessions of that type of stuff, breaking up your computer work, right? Because I'm assuming the reason you're inside is because you're in front of a computer, right? You're in either meetings virtually or meetings physically, right? Maybe you're in an office setting. And I would say having a room or an ability to go in, jump on a Peloton bike or a treadmill, where you have lots of red light stimulation plus a grounding effect of some kind with no blue light at that time. Do not have any Wi-Fi, Bluetooth enabled device on the body while you're doing those 20 minutes. Again, you're using those 20 minutes as rehab from the work that you've been doing, right? You have to take that mindset into consideration, because a lot of people will, put Bluetooth headphones in and, put on their favorite show and walk forever. Like that's counterproductive to what you're trying to do.
Yeah. It's getting harder and harder to get away with all of this, because like most of the places I've been, every single treadmill will work on Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and without that, they won't even switch on. And you're like,
I know. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's literally making permanent customers, right? You're on the treadmill to get better insulin sensitivity, to better your health and better your body composition. But there's this big, and they're not even small screens anymore. They're like a full-size TV.
The way I was counteracting with people I'm working with, I just, most of them will have this equipment in garage, and I'm like, just open the doors and at least you'll get something.
Yeah, if you have it in the garage, that's a damn good hack. In fact, I am a big fan of garage. Like in my house that I'm building, I literally have 2 big windows that'll have special glass in it that's like they're open, right? That lets sunlight in. And then I have a French door that's going to open. It's like a 5-foot door that will open, and it literally goes into sunset, right? So the sun will be setting in those doors. Because that's when I like to work out, is in the afternoons, mid-afternoons or so. And so, yeah, anyway, I'm a big fan of people that have their workout equipment in gyms or in a room where you can open windows, open doors, because that's a super simple hack, costs you zero money.
So let's dig into things that might be harmful if you have too much insulin sensitivity, or maybe developing insulin resistance. You kind of touched up on insulin resistance, but let's say people go hypoglycemic all the time. What the hell can happen? What's happening?
Yeah, so in that particular case, I would suggest some kind of a diagnostic tool, whether that's a blood test or this more expensive blood, because just like you mentioned there, you can get the same effect from 2 different vectors, right? If you were getting poor insulin sensitivity, you might start to have stints of hypoglycemia because your body is overshooting and not understanding that the blood glucose, that it's overshot its blood glucose stuff. And so it's simulating too much insulin, and then you end up slightly hypo. And that's what causes the aberrant cravings for more food, even though you ate 90 minutes ago, right? So in that case, the answer or the fix would be change kind of the food setting or some of the hacks that we just talked about. Now, the second outcome is I am too insulin sensitive. In that case, the answer is more food, right? The answer is more food, not reducing food.
More food, what kind of food, food timing?
Yeah. Yeah. So in that case, it would be things that I would say that would be helpful would be things that digest long and slow, things like potato, not necessarily fast acting carbohydrates or a combination of fast acting carbohydrates if you need them to make up your calorie load. But I would include things that digest more slowly. And that would be basically be make sure that you are eating whole food meals, right? So that there's protein and some fats coming along with it to slow down the digestion so that the rise in blood glucose is more stable and not a big spike. You're really only going to run into that issue with like really, really good insulin sensitivity or what you mentioned, high insulin sensitivity. You're only really going to notice that when you start doing synthetic carbohydrates on purpose, right? Like pre or post workout type of scenarios where you're really insulin sensitive, not just because of the workout, but also because you are actually physically insulin sensitive. And then you down, 300 or 400 grams of carbs with your shake, right? That's going to be almost, I wouldn't say instant, but within an hour, most of that's going to be in the bloodstream, right? Your body's going to definitely overshoot that or really be aggressive about lowering that, right? And because you're really good insulin sensitivity, that's going to be a big spike in insulin, and then you are going to end up with a little bit of hypoglycemia after.
So when you talk about that, that's something probably that more specific just for me. If I consume Vitargo, I don't have any issues. If I am
Mm-hmm.
following what every new bodybuilder does now, Cocoa Pops and whatever, then I have a lot of issues. So what's
Yeah.
happening?
Yeah. So Vitargo is a manufactured carbohydrate. Okay. So and by that I mean it's been chemically altered to kind of act a little bit different, actually, a little bit different in terms of um, it's not, there's zero fructose in it, number one. Okay. So there's a unique thing about fructose, which is highly associated with the other foods that you just talked about, the Cocoa Puffs and all of this. Okay. So it's not that fructose is bad, it's that fructose does something unique. Fructose does a thing where it actually understimulates insulin production to the amount of carbohydrate you took. So fructose does not elicit an insulin response. So you'll end up undershooting the insulin for how much glucose ends up. So it actually causes that delayed effect. So you end up with a little bit of brain fog. You end up with some lethargy because glucose keeps climbing and climbing. But your body goes, hey, we're making enough insulin. This shouldn't be happening. And then all of a sudden it realizes 30 or 40 minutes later, hey, this is still climbing. And then it really ramps it up. And then it puts you in the gutter. Vitargo is almost a one-to-one type of release where think of it almost like a think of it like a slow acting carbohydrate source like potato or rice or things of that nature, but it's in a format that releases quickly. So your body interprets it correctly. That goes, oh, this must have been, think of it almost like you blended up your potato and blended up your rice and then you ate it. Yes, it's going to come into the bloodstream faster because it's already pre-digested, but the signaling effect is one-to-one. So your body acts accordingly. Does that make sense? It's
Yeah, it
the
makes absolute
composition.
sense to me because I still have these people fighting over, but I'm just matching my calories. And I'm like, but that's why your physique looks the way it looks, because you're matching calories and you don't understand that it just does not work that way.
Yeah, yeah. The fructose is one of the ones that I would say you have to pay attention to how much fructose you consume
And
because it
especially
does
for
some.
someone as big as myself, I believe it was up to 60 grams of fructose. Body kind of deals easily, and
Mhm.
over 60 grams a day, you start messing it up. And
Yeah,
it's a
yeah, and that's a little
bit
bit
overeat
individual, right?
if you're
Yeah,
consuming 8,000 calories a day.
yeah, yeah, and again, this is where some people will get away with more of that than others, right? And that has to do with your mitochondrial lineage. If your mitochondria come from an L1, L0 haplotype, you actually will have more of that enzyme that breaks up fructose. So your insulin response to fructose will be closer to one-to-one versus somebody who has less of that enzyme. So somebody that has mitochondria from a higher latitude will be able to process less fructose than somebody from a lower latitude in terms of their mitochondrial haplotype, and that is where that discrepancy widens or shortens. Of hey, I consume this much fructose, and my body interprets that amount of insulin correctly for that amount of fructose, or it ends up less, and your glucose load goes up because fructose is having to go to the liver, and then the liver processes it and breaks it down into the glucose. So glucose continues to climb, but it's climbing at a delayed rate, and the insulin isn't matching it.
So improving insulin sensitivity, you kind of mentioned, hey, be physically active, more muscle, always going to help with anything health related. Step outside more often than not. Liver. How do we check liver health and what's happening there?
Yeah. So there's obviously simple tests for liver, but I'm gonna touch on
Can I
this.
throw you
The
another
norm,
thing is that acute liver, let me say dysfunction or whatnot, does it happen after flights? Because that's when our body is just all over the place. So
yeah,
it be because of the flight affecting livers, and it affects, it affects our circadian rhythm. So how do we overcome all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So the liver is highly sensitive to hydration, right? It really depends on hydrogen, right? AKA cellular water, not the water that you drink. Liver and kidneys are very sensitive to that. You can check this in blood work with your BUN, your blood urea nitrogen ratio, and your creatinine ratio. BUN ratio, if that's aberrant, it tells me that your liver is having a hard time processing everything. And that's a big deal because your liver processes a lot of things, right? And that's also why sunlight stimulation at the liver area improves just about every single process that the liver does. The reason for that is twofold. You make more cellular water in that tissue when you expose yourself to sunlight, and enzymatic creation, because your liver makes a lot of enzymes there, especially enzymes that deal with damage and processing anything from medications to actual chemicals that your own body makes. And that's the P450 enzyme. That's up very, very abundant in the liver. And the key thing, especially why I brought up the P450, is P450, it's labeled that because 450 is the nanometers of light that enzyme relies on to make all of its actions happen. That you're not going to get indoors. You're not going to get that wavelength indoors. It can only come from sunlight. That's also why the primary treatment for high bilirubin is sunlight, right? And a lot of people, especially in the bodybuilding world, are like, oh, I need milk thistle and all of these liver pills, to restore my liver function because my liver is not. I'm like, I mean, those show some signs, but they're hit and miss. The reason why they're hit and miss is because they're also reliant on these enzymes that the liver makes, right? So if the liver's not making the enzymes, none of those are really going to do anything. So if you really want to get some out of those things, or my preferred method is you don't really need to take them, just get more actual stimulation to the liver of hydrating it properly. So what you mentioned about flights, the reason why flights are going to affect the liver very, very acutely is because that is a very dehydrating event. You're not grounded. There's no sunlight, lots of electromagnetic fields with all the equipment from the plane and all the equipment from the port, right? So you're literally inducing a cellular dehydration effect. And depending on the flight length, it could be large amount of time, right? It could be 10 hours or more, depending on the flight. And that's why I say, if it's a flight that's under 3 hours, you're not going to notice it as much. If it's a flight that's verging on the 5 hours and longer, you're going to start to notice it. And then from that point, the longer the flight, the more you're going to notice it. That 5 hour mark is crucial in terms of mitigation strategies that I will use in terms of what to do to not be as dehydrated while you fly, and that will improve how the liver works. Yes.
And we saw that when we were following my blood tests, when I was doing a lot of flying, literally every single month, every couple of weeks, 7, 12, 14, 36-hour flights. And my body was just like fighting to stay hydrated. My liver enzymes were fine, but everything else was like, dude, slow down.
Yes, absolutely. And so there is lots of ways that the body can try to rehydrate you or keep you hydrated in a dehydrating event. It'll be a little bit individual. Some of the big hitters, prolactin level might go up. Other heavy hitters is your water retention will go up. That's almost universal for just about everybody. Sodium intake might be retained. So when you get blood work, or you just feel more cravings for what, like most people will interpret it as hunger, unfortunately, but what it really means is you need more water, right? Because it'll start to retain salt to try to keep more hydration inside the tissues, salt and potassium. And so you'll feel puffy, you'll feel dry mouth, and the craving should be interpreted, or I just by default, hey, if you're traveling, it's water that you want, not food. It's water that you want and not food. And that's another thing that I use. I tend to tell people to try not to eat food while you are traveling. The reason for that is because food needs fluids to digest, right? Like even though you might drink water with it, it's got to bring third space fluids to the gut membranes to take those nutrients and they'll put them out to the bloodstream. You want to kind of not do that when you know that you're dehydrating yourself, right? That same strategy when you're going to do a water cut. Most people that are doing a water cut aren't going to have any food, so they don't have this problem. But if you happen to have really like, hey, I'm going to do a water cut tomorrow, right? And so they tend to overeat solid food for that day. And then they try to do a water cut and then they feel even more dehydrated. And the reason is because all the fluid is going away from the tissues, right? Away from your working muscles and muscles that you need to move around and going to the gut to try to keep that hydration state so that your gut doesn't get bound up and twisted, right? There's a reason for that. So another strategy is I actually employ this modified fasting thing that we talked about in the previous video almost exclusively every time somebody gets on an airplane flight that's around 3 hours or longer. I just tell them, hey, about an hour or two before hopping on the plane, have your last meal. Do not eat any solid food while you're in the air or until after 90 minutes after leaving the airport for this reason, so that you can dehydrate the least amount as possible.
Yeah, sounds great. And a lot of people go like, dude, I'm paying business class through tickets and 3-course meal twice in a trip and this and that. These are the things that you need to kind of overcome and just kind of mentally set up like what's more important, you being healthy.
Well, and a lot of people may not know that they're being dehydrated, right? Like once you know the information, then you go, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. I probably shouldn't, right? And then
they get dehydrated because they have lots of beer and wine and everything on top of that. They're just like, let's just enjoy the trip.
Yeah.
But yeah, let me round this up. So insulin sensitivity, extremely important for overall health. Physically, mentally, you have more. If your insulin sensitivity is kind of impaired, you're not going to burn as much body fat as you could, not going to build muscle tissue as quick as you could. You will have issues with your energy staying steady throughout the day. Easiest ways to actually combat that and improve this is just staying active. I implement specifically timed feeding. I know exactly when I'm going to eat and what I'm going to eat. So it just keeps it easy. Light walks after meal. It doesn't have to be half an hour. It doesn't 5-10 minutes. It's any no longer than that. And making sure you're being outside. For our British viewers, it doesn't have to be intense sun. It just needs to be outside. Am I getting this correct?
Yes, absolutely. Because just to add a little bit more detail, even when the sun is not strong, it's still emitting red light all the time, right? Even through clouds. Like right now, it's a cloudy day for me.
Not going outside.
Correct, because of what I stated earlier. Red light therapy, the actual red light is what lowers, that's the light spectrum that's going to improve insulin sensitivity. So even on a cloudy day, you're getting red light therapy. If it's cold, I would still say you want to underdress for that, because we didn't talk about this, but cold will stimulate the uptake of glucose into working tissues faster than when it's hot.
And this is little tricks that I do every single time I train. I will have cold shower after my training session, and it increases my appetite and it increases my digestion. That's how I feel.
Yep.
So
no, that's 100% true, because it'll actually stimulate gastric emptying, right? So cold stimulates gastric emptying, aka your digestion speeds up and processing of food speeds up.
Awesome, David. Let's wrap this up, not overshoot our time usually. And thank you for your time again, and I'll see you in the next video.
Awesome. Thank you very much.